The millionaire's son was in an induced coma, trapped in a web of tubes and machines, but the drugs keeping him alive were also slowly killing him. A terrible secret only the hospital's simple cleaning lady seemed to notice. Then, one day, the father entered the room and saw the most terrifying scene of his life. The cleaning lady was deliberately unplugging the machines that kept his son alive. He opened his mouth to scream for help, but something held him back. What he did next was an act of blind faith, a move that changed everything forever. Richard Warren's empire was a steel and glass giant that scraped the sky, a testament to his ability to turn capital into a fortune so vast it was nearly immeasurable. His businesses spanned continents. His name was whispered with reverence on the trading floors of the stock exchange, and his net worth grew with the certainty of a law of nature. He was a man who understood profit, dividends, and the cash flow that kept the world spinning. However, that entire universe of power and wealth now came down to a single, silent and aseptic room in his own mansion. The only sound that broke the oppressive silence was the rhythmic, insistent beep of the machines keeping his son, Leo, just 10 years old, alive. The boy had been in a medically induced coma for 3 long months, ever since the accident that shattered Richard's world. But something, beyond the initial tragedy, was terribly wrong. Instead of showing the slightest improvement, Leo's small body seemed to surrender a little more each day, a slow, agonizing retreat that the world's top specialists, with their expensive video conferences and diagnoses, couldn't explain. The medications, which should have been a bridge to recovery, felt like a subtle poison. The head nurse, Veronica, commanded that room with the precision of a general on a battlefield. A middle-aged woman with an immaculate bun and a gaze that betrayed no emotion, she ensured the cocktail of medications was administered with a cold, almost robotic efficiency. To Veronica, Leo was a set of vital signs, a chart to be monitored, an equation to be solved. It was into this environment of contained despair and sterility that Sophia was hired. A simple cleaning woman, a widow, with eyes that carried the weight of old losses but also harbored a compassion that this house, transformed into a private hospital, hadn't seen in a long time. While Richard saw guilt incarnate and Veronica saw a medical record, Sophia saw what was really there, a sleeping child in need of human warmth. She began her work in silence, her gentle movements barely disturbing the heavy air of the room, and it was on her 3rd day that she noticed Veronica, with her flawless posture, was preparing the IV bag. From a small, unlabeled glass vial, she drew a clear liquid with a syringe and injected it into the container. Moments later, as Sophia wiped the metal base of the IV stand with a damp cloth, a subtle, anomalous scent hit her nostrils. It wasn't the smell of alcohol, or medicine, or anything that belonged in that environment. It was a sweetish odor, almost imperceptible, with a metallic note underneath, a smell that shouldn't have been there. Sophia looked up, watching the liquid drip slowly, carrying that strange substance directly into the boy's veins. Her heart gave a jolt, a cold premonition running down her spine. She looked at Leo's serene face, then at Veronica's straight back as she disposed of the used syringe. The smell felt like a whispered secret, a warning that only she, for some terrible reason, could hear. The next day, Sophia entered Leo's room with a heavy heart. The anomalous scent from the day before haunted her memory, a sensory dissonance in the meticulously controlled environment. She began her routine, the automatic gestures of cleaning serving as a disguise for her heightened attention. Her eyes never strayed from the figure of Veronica, who moved with an economy of motion that bordered on indifference. The nurse prepared the medications, her expression as neutral as ever. Again, the small, unlabeled vial appeared, The needle pierced the rubber stopper, the clear liquid was drawn, and with a soft click, injected into the IV bag. Sophia held her breath. Minutes later, as she cleaned the chrome feet of one of the machines, the scent returned. Subtle, sweetish, metallic. It was the same. A chill ran down her arms. This time, her gaze darted to the monitors. The green line representing Leo's heartbeat, once a steady rhythm of peaks and valleys, seemed to tremble. It was a tiny spasm, an almost imperceptible hesitation before it resumed its pace. Anyone else would have dismissed it as interference, a machine's whim. But Sophia, who in her youth had learned to read those signals, felt a knot form in her stomach. She watched the boy. His skin, already so pale, seemed to take on a grayish hue, a shadow of sickness that hadn't been there an hour before. Gathering a courage she didn't know she possessed, she approached Veronica, who was jotting down data on a clipboard. "Excuse me, Mrs. Veronica," Sophia began, her voice shakier than she would have liked. I noticed a slightly different smell coming from the IV. After you add the medication." Veronica raised her eyes slowly, and the contempt in them was as cold as surgical steel. "A smell," she repeated, the word sounding like an absurdity. "I deal with chemical compounds all day. You deal with bleach. Your senses must be confused." Sophia pressed on. The image of the trembling line on the screen seared into her mind. But the heart monitor also, it seemed to glitch for a second. Veronica's expression hardened, transforming into a mask of icy irritation. "Look here," she said, her voice low and sharp. "You were hired to clean. Stick to your cleaning and leave the medicine to the professionals. If I hear another word about your olfactory delusions or imaginary diagnoses, I will personally make sure you never work in this city again. Am I clear?" Sophia shrank back, her face burning with humiliation. She mumbled a "Yes, ma'am," and returned to her cleaning cart, her hands trembling. The veiled threat terrified her. Losing this job would be a disaster. The income she earned here was the only thing keeping her afloat. But the fear for her financial security was overshadowed by a growing fear for the boy's life. She saw Richard Warren standing across the hall, watching his son through the glass of the door, a multi-millionaire whose vast assets couldn't buy a single healthy beat for Leo's heart. The pain on that man's face was a mirror of the panic growing inside her. Later that afternoon, the pattern repeated. Another dose, the same smell, the same hesitation on the monitor, the same grayish pallor on the boy's skin. Veronica was methodical, precise, and her method seemed to be slowly killing Leo. Sophia finished her shift, her heart as heavy as lead. On her way out, she passed the storage room where the special medical waste was kept in red biohazard containers. She saw Veronica discard the small empty vial, the same one as always. A terrible, dangerous idea began to form in her mind. She had no proof, no credibility. Her word against the head nurses was a whisper of wind against a brick wall. If she wanted to do anything, she would need more than a suspicion. She would need the vial itself. Night fell heavily on Sophia. In her small apartment, the safety of her home brought no peace. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the green line of the heart monitor trembling, Leo's pale face, Veronica's frigid glare. The nurse's words echoed in her mind, a threat that jeopardized her meager stability, the only income she had to pay her bills. Losing this job would be devastating, but the image of the boy, so helpless, was even more terrifying. She thought of Richard Warren, a man whose fortune was so vast it was measured in compound interest on international hedge funds, a billionaire who could move markets with a phone call but was powerless at his own son's bedside. All that money, all the assets that made up his empire, were worthless if they couldn't save that one life. A painful, unshakable conviction formed in her chest. Her silence would make her an accomplice. Her mission was a form of poison too, driven by a force that came from the depths of her soul. She stood up. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now accompanied by a fierce determination. She put on dark clothes and, in the dead of night, made her way back to the mansion. The house, a monument to its owner's wealth, was a silent fortress under the moonlight. Sophia knew the routines, the security blind spots. The service entrance, used by suppliers, was her best bet. With her heart hammering against her ribs, she managed to slip inside unseen, moving through the shadows of hallways she traversed during the day with a bucket and a mop. Every creak of the hardwood floor sounded like thunder in her ears. Her destination was the small disposal room, where the medical waste was stored before collection. The door was unlocked. As always, inside, the smell of antiseptic was strong. The red containers with the biohazard symbol were lined up against the wall. Her hands were shaking so badly she struggled to lift the lid of the container where she'd seen Veronica toss the vial. The air that escaped was a sterile, unpleasant mix. With a rising nausea, she plunged her hand, protected by a glove she had brought, into the midst of the plastic bags. She felt the plastic of used syringes, the soft texture of stained gauze, the cold of other containers. The fear of being discovered was a physical presence, a chill that ran up her spine. Her fingers searched through the trash, brushing against objects her mind preferred not to identify, and then she felt it. Small, cylindrical, made of glass. With her heart in her throat, she pulled it out. It was it, the unlabeled vial, almost empty, but with a residual drop of the clear liquid gleaming at the bottom. A wave of triumph and terror washed over her. She clutched it tightly, the proof that she wasn't crazy. She hid the small treasure in the deepest pocket of her coat, feeling the cold glass against her skin. The exact moment the container lid closed with a muffled thud, she froze. Footsteps. Someone was coming down the hall. The sound was brisk, purposeful, and getting dangerously close to the disposal room door. Sophia shrank into the shadows, holding her breath, the vial in her pocket feeling like it weighed a ton. The doorknob began to turn. The door opened with a soft creak, and Sophia flattened herself against the cold wall, her entire body tensed like a violin string. A sliver of light from the hallway cut through the darkness of the disposal room, falling inches from her feet. It was one of the night security guards, an older man named Armando, making his usual rounds. He poked his head in, swept the small room with the beam of his flashlight, and Day, satisfied that nothing was out of the ordinary, pulled back and closed the door. The click of the lock was the loudest sound Sophia had ever heard. She waited, counting her own erratic heartbeats, until the sound of Armando's footsteps faded into the distance. Only then did she allow herself to breathe. Escaping the mansion was even more harrowing than getting in. Every shadow seemed like an enemy, every nocturnal noise an alarm. When she finally reached the safety of her apartment, she locked the door and leaned against it, her body trembling uncontrollably. She took the small vial from her pocket. Under the yellow light of her kitchen, the residue of liquid looked harmless, almost like water, but she knew what it did. It was proof, but it was useless proof in her hands. Who would believe her? A cleaning woman against the head nurse of one of the richest men in the world. It would be her word against that of a respected professional. She'd be fired, maybe even accused of something terrible. The next day, exhaustion and fear were her constant companions. Trying to act normal was torture. While cleaning Leo's room, she couldn't stop casting furtive glances at Veronica, who seemed more vigilant, sharper. Richard Warren sat in an armchair in the corner, as if he were part of the furniture. He was the picture of desolation, a man whose thoughts normally revolved around acquisitions, stock market volatility, or the profitability of his investments in gold and cryptocurrencies. A man who had built a net worth of billions, but who now looked at his son and saw only the greatest liability of his life, the inability to protect him. Sophia approached Leo's bed. The boy looked so fragile, moved by an impulse. She began to speak to him in a whisper. telling him about the sun shining outside, about the birds singing in her backyard. She adjusted the sheet over his small chest with a tenderness that was not part of her duties. From across the room, Richard lifted his head. He was used to the mechanical efficiency of the medical team, but this was different. Sophia's soft voice, the tenderness in her gesture, was an unexpected balm in that sterile environment. For the first time in months, he didn't see an employee, but a person showing genuine affection for his son. A fragile, unfamiliar warmth bloomed in his chest. He watched her, and for an instant, the wall of pain around his heart cracked. That glimpse of humanity in Richard Warren's eyes was repeated in the following days. He seemed to emerge from the fog of his grief, his focus shifting, if only for brief moments. From his inert son to the woman who cleaned the room with a quiet dignity. He watched her talk to Leo, her voice a gentle murmur that filled the space between the electronic beeps. She didn't talk about the illness or the mansion. She talked about simple things, about the taste of a ripe mango, about the feeling of rain on your face. One day, as Sophia was wiping the window frame, Richard stood up and walked over to her, his expensive shoes making a muffled sound on the polished floor. "What's your name?" he asked. His voice was deep, rusted from disuse. Sophia started, turning to face the man whose fortune was legendary. "Sophia, sir. My name is Sophia." He nodded, his gaze fixed on her face. "I see how you treat my son. You care about him. Thank you." The words were simple, but for Sophia, who lived under the terror of Veronica's threat, they sounded like a pardon. A small smile touched her lips for the first time in days. "He's a lovely boy, sir. It's easy to care about him." The scene did not go unnoticed by Veronica. From her observation post, she saw the exchange of words, the softening in her employer's posture, the smile on the cleaning woman's face. To the nurse, this was a fire alarm. The proximity between Richard and Sophia was a dangerous, unacceptable variable in her carefully calculated equation. A cleaning woman with access to the billionaire's empathy was a direct threat. She needed to sever that bond before it could strengthen. Later that day, she found Richard alone in the hallway, looking at a photograph of Leo before the accident. She approached with an expression of professional concern. "Mr. Warren, may I have a word?" He turned, his face a mask of exhaustion. "Of course, Veronica." She lowered her voice, instilling each syllable with a tone of confidence and urgency. "It's about the cleaning woman, Sophia. I've been observing her. I know you're going through a time of extreme vulnerability, and that's precisely why I feel obligated to warn you." Richard frowned. "Warn me about what? She seems like a good woman." Veronica sighed, a rehearsed sound of reluctance. "Exactly, she seems. But people in desperate financial situations, when faced with wealth like yours, with this kind of fortune, sometimes develop unhealthy attachments, a kind of fantasy. The way she talks to Leo, as if he can hear her. It's becoming obsessive. It's a fine line between caring and emotional instability. I wouldn't want anyone to take advantage of your pain." Veronica's words, sharp and precise, found their mark. Richard, a man who built his empire on cold business logic and calculated distrust, felt a chill run through him. The vulnerability Sophia had touched in him now seemed like a dangerous weakness. He remembered that he knew absolutely nothing about this woman, except her name. At that moment, Sophia came out of Leo's room to get her cart in the hall. As she passed them, she offered a small nod to Richard, the remnant of her smile still on her lips, but the look she received in return was no longer one of gratitude. It was a cold, distant, and unmistakably suspicious gaze. The seed of poison had been planted, and Sophia felt the floor disappear from under her feet. The change in Richard Warren's behavior was immediate and cutting. The fragile warmth that had bloomed between them was extinguished, replaced by a barrier of ice. His eyes now followed her around the room with a cold suspicion. Each of her gestures weighed and judged. He no longer spoke to her. His silent thanks turned into a mute scrutiny that left her nervous and with sweaty palms. Veronica's words, whatever they had been, had poisoned the only source of hope Sophia had found. The mansion, already a place of tension, became her private prison. Every beep from the monitors now sounded like an accusation. Every glance from Richard, a sentence. She continued to speak to Leo, but now she did so in almost inaudible whispers, with the constant fear of being misinterpreted, of having her affection twisted and used against her. Meanwhile, Veronica consolidated her power. With Richard's trust in Sophia shaken, the head nurse began to control access to the room with even greater rigor. She dismissed other staff members on vague pretexts, isolating Leo and, by extension, herself. The room became her fiefdom, a laboratory where she executed her plan with terrifying calm. Sophia watched her administer the liquid from the unlabeled vial, the same macabre routine, and felt an overwhelming helplessness. The vial she had risked everything to obtain remained hidden in her locker, a useless secret. Taking it to the police was unthinkable. What would she complain about? A strange smell and a gut feeling. They would laugh her out of the station, and the news would certainly reach Richard's ears, sealing her fate. Despair began to eat away at Sophia's courage. Maybe Veronica was right. Maybe she was just imagining things, her mind creating patterns where none existed. Maybe the stress and fear were making her delusional. One day, at the end of her shift, she found Richard in the garden. He stood with his back to her, looking at the horizon, a man isolated on his own island of gold. Her pain pushed her to do the unthinkable. She approached, her heart leaping. "Mr. Warren," she said, her voice low. He turned, and the coldness in his eyes made her want to retreat. "What do you want?" The brutality of the question hurt her, but she persisted. "I know that Ms. Veronica may have said things about me, but I just want you to know that I truly care about your son, and I'm scared. There's something wrong happening in that room." Richard stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Wrong?" he repeated. "The best doctors in the world are looking after my son. Nurse Veronica is the most competent professional I have ever met. The only thing wrong here, Sophia, is you overstepping your bounds." He turned his back, ending the conversation. The rejection was like a slap in the face. Sophia stood frozen, humiliation burning her cheeks, as the man who held all the power to help her walked away. In that moment, she felt utterly alone, an ant trying to stop an avalanche. She looked back at the window of Leo's room, a square of light in the mansion's vast facade, and a dark certainty washed over her. No one was coming to help. If anything was going to be done, it would have to be by her, and she had no idea how. With every passing day, Leo's life slipped away a little more, and her time to act was running out. Richard's rejection was the final nail in the coffin of her hope. Sophia went home that night feeling smaller than ever, an insignificant figure on the grand chessboard of the billionaire's life. All his vast fortune, his businesses that spread across the globe like a spider's web, only served to build higher walls between him and the truth. In her small apartment, she took out the glass vial, the dangerous secret she kept. Under the dim light of the kitchen bulb, it looked harmless. A drop of liquid, a lifetime. What could she, a simple cleaning woman, do? Who could she turn to? Richard Warren's power and money could buy the silence and loyalty of anyone. She was alone, caught between the moral responsibility to save a child and the paralyzing fear of losing everything. She sat at her table, her head in her hands, despair a cold wave threatening to drown her. And it was then, at the rock bottom of despair, that a spark ignited. An old memory from a simpler time before the losses and hardships. She remembered her brief time as a nursing assistant, before life forced her down other paths. She remembered the smiling face of a colleague, a young pharmacy student as brilliant and curious as she was quiet and observant. Her name was Helena. They would spend hours talking during night shifts, Helena passionately explaining the chemical composition of medications, how they interacted with the human body. "I don't just want to dispense, Sophia," she would say. "I want to understand." Helena. The name echoed in her mind like a bell. What had become of her? Had she become the talented pharmacist she had promised to be? The idea was a shot in the dark, a desperate gamble, but it was the only one she had. The next day, her day off, Sophia used what little money she had to travel across the city. She went to old neighborhoods, to hospitals where they had worked, asking for a pharmacist named Helena. No one seemed to remember. Hope began to wither, turning her search into a melancholy pilgrimage through her own past. It was late afternoon when, in a small neighborhood pharmacy, a modest place that contrasted with the large chains, she found her. Helena was behind the counter, her hair now streaked with silver, but with the same bright, intelligent eyes. The recognition was mutual and instantaneous, followed by an awkward hug filled with years of silence. They had coffee in the pharmacy's small break room, the initial conversation stumbling over memories and updates. But Sophia couldn't relax. Finally, gathering all her courage, she cut in. "Helena, I need your help. It's more serious than anything I've ever faced." The change in her tone put Helena on alert. With trembling hands, Sophia took a small handkerchief from her pocket and unfolded it on the table, revealing the glass vial. "I work at Richard Warren's house. His son. He's dying, and I think I know why." Helena picked up the small vial, her professional eyes analyzing the almost invisible residue. She looked at Sophia's pale, anguished face. The silence stretched on, heavy with danger and possibilities. "Sophia," Helena said at last, her voice low and grave, "what exactly are you asking me to do?" Sophia's request hung in the dense air of the small break room, between the smell of coffee and the hum of the old refrigerator. Helena looked from the vial to her friend's face, a face she remembered as young and full of shy smiles, now marked by exhaustion and fear. "I'm asking the impossible, I know," Sophia whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm asking you to risk everything on a hunch." She then unraveled the whole story, the words tumbling out in a confused torrent of panic and conviction. The sweetish smell, the almost imperceptible arrhythmia on the monitor, the grayish pallor of Leo's skin, Veronica's cold threat, and finally, the wall of mistrust erected by Richard Warren. "He's a man who understands the value of an investment," Sophia said with unexpected bitterness, "but he can't see he's losing the most precious asset he has." Helena listened in silence, her expression growing more serious with every word. She picked up the vial again, holding it to the light. "The sample is minuscule, Sophia. Running an official analysis on this without a requisition is impossible. It would raise every red flag in the world." She looked into Sophia's eyes, and her friend saw the old flame of determination she had always admired. "But that doesn't mean we can't do anything." Sophia's heart leaped. "I still have a friend, a former professor, who runs a research lab at the university. He owes me a favor. I can ask him to run a chromatography analysis, off the record. But I need you to understand the risk. If we're discovered, I lose my license. And you'll be challenging a man whose power can crush people like us without even noticing." Sophia nodded, a tear rolling down her face. "I already lost everything that mattered once in my life, Helena. I'm not going to stand by and watch it happen to someone else." Meanwhile, in the silent mansion, Richard Warren tried to focus on a spreadsheet detailing his stock returns, but the numbers danced meaninglessly before his eyes. His mind, normally a fortress of logic and calculation, was in turmoil. The image of Sophia in the garden, her pleading eyes, haunted him. There's something wrong happening in that room. Her accusation was absurd. Veronica was the personification of competence. And yet, he remembered a moment earlier that day. Veronica, on the phone with a supplier, had let her professional mask slip for a second. Her voice had become sharp, filled with a disproportionate cruelty over a minor delivery error. It was a fleeting but disturbing glimpse of a personality that didn't fit the image of the serene caregiver. The distrust the nurse had planted against Sophia was now at war with the seed of doubt Sophia herself had sown in his mind. He felt lost, a man used to dealing with clear assets and liabilities, now sinking in a swamp of grey emotions and conflicting intuitions. Later that night, Sophia's phone rang, the shrill sound cutting through the silence of her apartment. It was Helena. Her voice was tense, devoid of any warmth. "Sophia, I have news, and it's not good." Sophia held her breath. "What did you find?" she asked, her heart hammering. "My friend got a preliminary analysis," Helena said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "It's not a medication. It's nothing that should be in an IV bag. It's a complex organic compound, a substance he's never seen before. But he was able to identify its primary effect. It's a slow-acting cardiotoxin designed to weaken the heart gradually, mimicking natural organ failure." An icy cold enveloped Sophia. "But there's one more thing," Helena continued, her voice even more urgent. "My contact just called me. The lab's security system registered an unauthorized remote access to the analysis files, minutes after he saved the results. Someone knows we're investigating." Helena's words fell on Sophia like a death sentence. A cardiotoxin. The word was ugly, clinical, and terrifyingly real, and the revelation of the remote access to the lab turned fear into pure panic. An abyss opened up beneath her feet. This was no longer a silent suspicion. It was a declared war, and the enemy knew exactly where she was. She didn't sleep that night, sitting in the gloom of her living room, the silent phone in her hand. Every creak of the building, every car headlight that swept past her window was an omen. They knew whoever was behind this, whoever had the power and resources to hack into a university lab system, now saw her as a threat to be neutralized. Veronica's cold, impassive face floated in her mind. Was it her? Did she have accomplices? The web of danger seemed to expand with every minute, tangling her in its invisible threads. Going to work the next morning was the hardest act of her life. Every step toward that mansion felt like a step into a trap. Upon entering Leo's room, the air was charged with a palpable electricity. Veronica was there, more immaculate than ever. And when her eyes met Sophia's, there was a tiny, almost imperceptible glint of victorious triumph. There were no words, no accusations, just that look that said, "I know, and there's nothing you can do." The day dragged on in silent torture. Sophia tried to focus on her work, but her hands trembled, and her gaze was constantly drawn to the IV bag, to Veronica's hands, to the monitor that measured Leo's fragile life. The nurse, for her part, seemed to be staging a play. She explained every procedure aloud for an absent Richard Warren, as if creating an alibi for an invisible audience. The retaliation came mid-afternoon. Veronica sought out Richard in his office, her expression a mask of grave concern. "Mr. Warren, we've had a very serious incident. I was informed by one of our medical equipment suppliers of an attempted unauthorized access to Leo's monitoring records. Someone from the outside is trying to obtain information on his condition." Richard, who had built a fortune on secrecy and data protection, felt a chill. He knew information was the most valuable currency, whether on the stock market or in personal life. "How is that possible?" he snarled. Veronica lowered her gaze. "We don't know yet, but Leo's security is my top priority. We need to limit access to his room to essential medical personnel only. Unfortunately, that includes the cleaning staff." She paused, letting the insinuation hang in the air. "Sophia, she has shown an unusual interest. I fear that, in her simplicity, she may have mentioned something to someone without realizing the danger." The trap was perfect. The doubt he felt about Sophia, fueled by Veronica's previous conversation, crystallized into suspicion. The cleaning woman had become a risk, an uncontrolled variable in his security equation. Minutes later, he found Sophia in the hallway. His face was like stone. "Sophia," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion, "starting today, your duties will be confined to the other rooms of the house. You will no longer enter my son's room." The words hit her with the force of a punch. She looked at him, stunned, trying to find the words to protest, to defend herself, but her throat closed up. He turned and walked back to the room, closing the door behind him with a soft, final click. Sophia stood in the hallway, staring at the closed door, the wooden barrier that now separated her from the child she was desperately trying to save. She was on the outside, and inside, the poison continued to drip. The closed door was more than a physical barrier. It was a monument to her defeat. Every time Sophia passed through that hallway, her gaze was drawn to the polished wood that separated her from Leo. She was on the outside, helpless, while the poison continued its silent work on the inside. Her new duties were a form of exile, cleaning empty drawing rooms and silent libraries, places that echoed the opulence and loneliness of that broken family. The humiliation of being treated as a threat was an open wound, but it was the image of Leo's grey face that tormented her. Veronica had won. She had isolated her victim, neutralized the only threat, and now had total control. The house, with all its vast wealth, its treasures and works of art, felt like a mausoleum. Sophia felt like a ghost tending to a tomb. Despair was a constant companion, whispering that she should give up, save herself, and flee from this nest of danger. Meanwhile, doubt was eating away at Richard Warren's soul. He sat in his lavish office, surrounded by the symbols of his success: stock charts, investment fund reports, the gleam of gold in a small bar he used as a paperweight. He was a master at analyzing risk, at identifying patterns, at feeling the pulse of the markets, and something in his own house was terribly out of sync. Veronica's explanation for the security breach was logical, professional. Banning Sophia was the prudent decision. Yet the peace that decision should have brought him never came. Instead, a feverish anxiety took hold. He remembered the genuine panic in Sophia's eyes. There's something wrong happening. It was the same gut feeling that had saved him from disastrous investments, the same instinct that had helped him build his billion-dollar fortune. Why, then, was he ignoring it now? He began to watch Veronica more closely, not as an employer, but as an analyst, and he noticed the small cracks in her perfect facade, the way her eyes never showed true sadness, only a performative concern, the rigidity in her shoulders when she thought no one was looking, the absence of any spontaneous gesture of tenderness toward Leo. She was too perfect, and in her perfection there was something inhuman. One day, Sophia was tasked with deep cleaning Richard's office. It was the first time she had entered that sanctuary of power. There were pictures of Leo everywhere. Leo on a sailboat, Leo on a soccer field, Leo smiling with a chocolate-smeared mouth. On a shelf, between books on business and economics, was a worn, beloved volume, a book of children's fables. Sophia picked it up, the pages soft from use. She opened it, and on the flyleaf, a dedication in Richard's hurried script: "To my champion. May you always find the courage of the lion and the wisdom of the owl. Love, Dad." A wave of emotion hit her. This was the key. Not the scientific proof Helena had given her, but proof of the love that existed in that house before it was poisoned. A dangerous, audacious idea began to form. She could no longer speak to Richard, but maybe the book could. That night, in her apartment, she took a sheet of paper. In the clearest handwriting she could manage, she wrote a single sentence. She folded the paper carefully and placed it between the pages of the fable The Lion and the Mouse. The next day, with her heart in her throat, she returned the book to the office. But instead of putting it back on the shelf, she left it on Richard's desk, open to the exact page where the small note was hidden. Richard Warren walked into his office that afternoon, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. The silence of the mansion was a constant hum in his ears, a reminder of all he was losing. His eyes fell on the polished mahogany desk, and for the first time in hours, something broke through his fog of worry. There it was, Leo's Book of Fables, a forgotten treasure. He approached, his heart giving a painful lurch. He ran his fingers over the worn cover, the smell of paper and childhood flooding his memories. He remembered his own voice, reading those stories. Leo's laughter, the weight of his sleeping son in his lap. It was an echo from a world that felt a lifetime away. With a sigh, he sat down and opened the book, his eyes tracing the dedication he had written, and then he saw it, a small, folded slip of paper that didn't belong. His first instinct was irritation. Who would dare violate this sanctuary of memories? He unfolded it, ready to discard it, and then he read the sentence, written in a simple, neat hand. The owl, in its wisdom, sees in the dark what others miss. Please check the smell of the IV fluid. The owl, the wisdom of the owl. They were his own words, from his dedication, come back to haunt him. The message wasn't an accusation, it was a plea that connected directly to his conversation with Sophia, to his own gut feeling, to the coldness he saw in Veronica's eyes, the smell, Sophia's first complaint, which he had dismissed as a delusion. Suddenly, the puzzle pieces, which had seemed random and meaningless, began to click into place with terrifying clarity. The instinct that had made him a billionaire, his ability to smell deceit and opportunity in a sea of information, screamed inside him. You don't confront an opponent without irrefutable data. He picked up the phone, not to call the police, but the head of his personal security, a man whose loyalty and discretion were worth more than many of his stocks. The order was short and precise. Install a micro camera in Leo's room with high-definition audio and video streaming in real time to his computer. It was to be done that very night, during Veronica's shift change, without anyone noticing. It was a high-risk investment, but his most valuable asset was on the line. Meanwhile, Sophia endured another day of torment. She saw the door to Leo's room as a gravestone. Each time Veronica passed her in the hall, the nurse offered a thin, almost imperceptible smile, a gesture of pure dominance. Sophia felt she had failed. Her last, desperate attempt, the note in the book, had probably been found and discarded, serving only to deepen the suspicion against her. Hope had evaporated, leaving only the bitter residue of fear. At the end of the day, she was preparing to leave when she saw the security team moving discreetly down the hall. Her heart froze. Were they here for her? To escort her out permanently? She shrank into a corner, watching them enter and exit Leo's room with discreet cases while Veronica was on her break. She didn't understand what was happening, but her fear made her slip out silently, without saying goodbye to anyone. In his locked office, Richard Warren stared at his laptop screen. The image was crystal clear. He saw his son, motionless in the bed. Minutes later, Veronica entered the room. The routine began. She checked the monitors, made her notes, and then she turned to the medication tray. Richard leaned forward, his heart pounding uncontrollably. He watched her pick up the syringe, the IV bag, and then, from her pocket, a small, unlabeled glass vial. The laptop screen was a window into hell. Richard Warren watched, paralyzed, as Veronica, with the calm of a guardian angel, performed the actions of a demon. The small, unlabeled vial appeared. The needle drew the clear liquid, and she injected it into the IV bag. It was all real. Sophia's suspicion, his own intuition gnawing at his gut. It all materialized in that cold, digital image. He saw the poison begin to drip, an invisible countdown on his son's life. But the horror was just beginning. Veronica didn't put the vial away. With a coldness that froze Richard's soul, she filled a second syringe with the same liquid and injected that too. A double dose. An act of acceleration, a sudden rush to finish the job. In that instant, the multimillionaire understood that all his money, all the fortune he had amassed in years of ruthless business, was nothing but useless paper. He was just a man watching live, in high definition, the destruction of the only thing that truly mattered. And then the world collapsed. The alarms on the monitors mirrored on his screen began to shriek, a sharp, frantic sound that pierced the silence of his office. The line of Leo's heart rate, previously weak but stable, went into a free fall. It was a dizzying plunge, a green line diving toward an abyss. The numbers on the blood pressure monitor plummeted. The oxygen saturation flashed a desperate red. The sound of the real alarms coming from Leo's room down the hall reached his ears, and he shot to his feet, terror stealing his breath. In another part of the house, Sophia heard the same sound. It wasn't the usual warning beep. It was the code blue alarm, an electronic scream she knew all too well. There was no time to think, to hesitate. She knew, with a certainty that came from the depths of her soul, what Veronica had done. She dropped her cleaning cloth and ran, her feet barely touching the floor, driven by pure adrenaline. She burst through the door of the room at the exact moment Richard was leaving his office. The scene he saw upon entering the hall was his worst nightmare made real. The cleaning woman, the woman he'd been warned to distrust, was sprinting toward his son. He followed her, a scream trapped in his throat. He entered the room, and the scene froze him for a second of absolute horror. Sophia wasn't at the bedside. She was at the infusion pump, the machine sending the IV fluid into Leo's veins. With steady hands, she shut off the machine. The dripping stopped. The soft hum of the pump's motor died. To Richard's eyes, she was turning off his son's life support. "What are you doing?" he roared, his voice torn by grief and fury, lunging toward her like a wounded animal. But Sophia didn't back down. She turned and, with one hand, blocked his chest, a surprising strength in her small frame. With the other, she pointed to the monitor above Leo's bed. "Look!" she pleaded, her voice trembling but charged with desperate authority. And he looked, and what he saw froze the blood in his veins. The instant the machine was turned off, the heart rate line, which had been in a death spiral, stopped. For one agonizing second, it was flat, and then it rose, a small spike, then another. Slowly, painfully, it began to stabilize and climb. It wasn't an act of sabotage. It was an antidote. That's when Sophia reached into her apron pocket, pulled out the small glass vial she had been guarding for weeks, and pressed it into his paralyzed hand. Richard Warren's world shrank to that single instant, the green line on the monitor, climbing, the small glass vial in his hand, as cold as the death it contained. Sophia's desperate face, pleading with him to understand, and he understood. In a flash of brutal clarity, the facade of lies Veronica had built crumbled, revealing the rotten truth beneath. The poison wasn't just in the IV, it was in the words she had whispered, the distrust she had planted. The nurse, who a moment ago had been in a flurry of professional activity, trying to save the patient, froze when she saw the scene. Her eyes fixed on the vial in Richard's hand, and the mask of competence disintegrated. In its place appeared an expression of pure, cold hatred. The game was over. "Veronica," Richard said, and the name left his lips not as a question, but as a sentence. His voice, once torn by panic, was now the voice that closed billion-dollar deals, a steel blade forged in the fire of fury and grief. "The partner I drove into bankruptcy. Marshall, you're his sister, aren't you?" A thin, venomous smile curved Veronica's lips. He was more than a partner, he was my brother, and you destroyed him. You took everything from him. I thought it was only fair to take the only thing you had left, an inheritance of pain. Passed from one family to another, the confession was delivered without remorse, with a calm that was more terrifying than any scream. Richard didn't answer. He simply took out his phone, hit a single speed dial button, and said 2 words, "Office, now." Seconds later, the security team entered the room. The scene they found was one of terrible stillness, the head nurse standing defeated, the billionaire standing reborn in his fury, and the cleaning woman by the bedside, the silent guardian who had won the war. Veronica's removal was swift and quiet. She didn't fight. She just cast one last look of hatred at Richard before being escorted out. Her career, her plan, all of it turned to ash. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the now steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. It was the sound of life. Richard looked at the contaminated IV bag, then at the one Sophia had shut off. Evidence of a crime that had nearly cost him his soul. And then he turned to Sophia. She was still there by the bed, her hands trembling now that the adrenaline had passed. He looked at her, and for the first time, he truly saw her. Not the cleaning woman, not the suspect, but the woman whose courage and compassion had accomplished what all his vast fortune could not. He, the businessman, the master of capital and net worth, had made the worst investment of his life. He had invested his trust in the wrong person, and he had almost paid for it with the compounding interest of eternal grief. He began, his voice breaking, "I'm so sorry. I didn't believe you." The words were inadequate, ridiculous in the face of the enormity of his gratitude and his guilt. Sophia just nodded, her eyes filling with tears she finally allowed herself to shed. "I just wanted him to be okay," she whispered. He took a step forward and, in a gesture that surprised them both, took her hand. "You didn't just save my son, Sophia, you saved me." In that touch, a bridge was built over the chasm of pain and mistrust, and together they turned to look at Leo, whose chest rose and fell in a natural rhythm, breathing air that was finally free of poison. The weeks that followed were a slow, silent miracle. Without the poison suppressing his life force, Leo's body responded to the treatments with surprising eagerness. The grayish pallor gave way to a healthy glow, and the monitors, once harbingers of doom, became the soundtrack of recovery. Richard never left his son's side. He delegated the management of his empire, postponed meetings about profits and dividends, and ignored the fluctuations of the stock market. He discovered that the true return on his time was right there, holding Leo's small hand, reading the old fables in a low voice, feeling every small improvement as if it were the biggest deal of his life. Sophia was always there, no longer as an employee, but as an essential, comforting presence. She taught Richard how to change the sheets without disturbing the boy, how to interpret the small signs of comfort and discomfort. They moved in a silent harmony, united by a common purpose that transcended their vastly different backgrounds. One day, as they watched Leo sleep peacefully, Richard turned to her, his eyes full of an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Sophia," he said, his voice grave, "I've spent my whole life accumulating things, assets, property, a net worth most people can't even conceive of. But you gave me the one thing all my money couldn't buy, a second chance." He paused, searching for the right words. "I can't offer you money as payment. It would be an insult to what you did. But I can offer you an investment in you." He handed her an envelope. Inside, there wasn't a check, but a paid enrollment to one of the best nursing schools in the country, along with a grant to cover all her living expenses. "You were born to heal, Sophia," he said. "Go and become the nurse you were always meant to be." The tears that welled in Sophia's eyes were not of sorrow, but of a joy so overwhelming It left her speechless. She accepted, not as charity, but as a new beginning she had earned with her own courage. 3 weeks after that terrible night, Leo opened his eyes. The first word he whispered was, "Dad." Richard wept, a free, cleansing cry of a man who had been reborn from guilt and fear. Leo's recovery was a long road, but with each day he grew stronger, his laughter once again filling the silent halls of the mansion. Richard's gratitude for Sophia, over time, deepened, transforming into a reverent admiration and then into a quiet, unshakable love. He, the man who had seen her as a threat, now saw her as his salvation. She, the woman who taught him that healing sometimes comes not from the most expensive drugs, but from the courage of a good heart. The mansion, once a steel and glass giant housing a hospital room, finally became a home. A home where a billionaire learned that the greatest wealth isn't found in treasury bonds or cryptocurrency investments, but in the warmth of a hand holding his and the certainty that life, love, and courage are the only assets that truly matter.